je vais maintenant céder la parole à M. Rosenberg, et je dois dire que David est une personne absolument remarquable. Il est sociologue, mais il est surtout un militant. Un militant antifasciste, un amoureux de l'histoire sociale de Londres, un militant pour la Palestine, et sur son bloc, il se présente d'ailleurs comme un rebelle. Comme il s'est dit, il se présente comme le lifelong rebel. And also, et aussi, un socialiste. Il est éducateur populaire également et organise les visites guidées du Londres radical des quartiers juifs de l'East End, qui fut son quartier d'origine. Il donne également des cours au City Lit sur cette histoire sociale de la ville. Le City Lit, et je voudrais simplement le définir, est le plus grand centre d'éducation à horaire décalé pour adultes en Europe. Ça fait 27 000 étudiants par an. Ça se trouve au centre de Londres. Et en particulier, il a écrit de nombreux articles et des livres. En 2011 est paru Battlefield for the East End. Et en 2015, Rebel Footprints. Mais dans ce qui concerne le livre sur Cable Street, il évoque évidemment la mémorable bataille qui a eu lieu en 1936 à Cable Street, n'est-ce pas, où effectivement la population juive s'est alliée avec les mouvements de gauche et d'extrême gauche pour s'opposer à une manifestation des fascistes et qui est parvenue à chasser Mosley, malgré le fait que cette contre-manifestation ait été interdite par le ministre des Affaires étrangères anglais et que par conséquent, les manifestants ont aussi dû s'opposer à la police. Donc, ceci est une belle histoire que David, d'ailleurs, aime, j'imagine, expliquer aux personnes qui suivent ses parcours dans le quartier de l'East End. Dans ces derniers blocs, David émet des craintes sur la recrudescence des mouvements antisémites et fascistes en UK et en Europe. La campagne du Brexit doit avoir donné l'occasion également de fournir à la droite et à l'extrême droite une certaine plateforme actuellement en Angleterre. Donc, globalement, comment pourrions-nous définir David, si ce n'est qu'il est à la fois l'analyste et le dénonciateur de l'antisémitisme actif dans la vie sociale et politique anglaise. Il met aussi en garde contre le fait de certaines dénonciations de l'antisémitisme qui seront des facteurs de manipulation politique, comme c'est le cas actuellement dans les conflits qui agitent le Labour Party. Alors, je voudrais rappeler une parole de Shimon Peres, qui aurait déclaré « En Angleterre, il y a quelques antisémites et d'autres qui pensent ne pas l'être et qui le sont. » Alors, c'est sur ces paroles-là et sur les commentaires que peut-être M. Rosenberg va nuancer que je laisse la parole.
Thank you very much.
You stay here. You stay here.
All right. Okay. Many thanks for inviting me. I want to start with some personal biography. My grandparents came to Britain as Jewish child immigrants from Poland and Ukraine in the early 1900s. I grew up in an economically struggling Jewish family in inner London that gradually became more comfortable. My extended family were mostly Labour voters, plus some communist supporting relatives. My parents were not very religious, not actively Zionist, but they had no family in Israel, but sympathised with Israel in general. I became involved in socialist politics and anti-fascist activism when I was 16 years old. My first demonstration was against the National Front, a group formed in Britain in 1967 by convinced Nazis who recruited wider support by condemning black immigration and promoting British nationalism. Is it all clear so far? Yeah, right. Okay. I went to a demonstration when I was 16 with some Jewish friends from a Zionist youth group. I had illusions then about Israel-Palestine that I discarded long ago. Perhaps only one or two of the six Jewish friends I went to the demonstration with identify themselves as Zionists now. People can be persuaded by convincing arguments and evidence. Today, though, many leftists are better at condemning and proclaiming than persuading. I broke with Zionism because of my deepening involvement in anti-racism and anti-fascism, alongside a more serious engagement with the realities in Israel and Palestine. Today, there is little involvement of left-wing and liberal Zionists with the wider anti-racist and anti-fascist movement. Debates around Zionism and anti-Semitism have become more toxic in the left. Many Jews claim that the left does not take anti-Semitism seriously, that it trivialises the existence of anti-Semitism, or dismisses it as a few cranks with old prejudices. Many leftists say it cannot be compared with institutional racism that blacks, Muslims, migrant workers and refugees suffer every day. There is truth in all of these assertions, but we can't generalise. Also, many left-wing Zionists are quick to label people anti-Semites who make genuine observations about the impacts of different racism. In the 1970s, I was inspired by slogans: black and white, unite and fight, self-defence is no offence, and especially here to stay, here to fight, which implied the struggle was not only against discrimination, but it was a positive struggle for the rights of minorities to live as equals and develop their distinctive identities and culture. Another slogan of that time disturbed me: yesterday the Jews, today the blacks. At street level, the National Front targeted Caribbean and Asian communities. But fascists do not replace targets, they accumulate them. Anti-Semitism still played a role for fascists then and now. Two publications from that period explain this well. This is David Edgar, a pamphlet, Racism, Fascism and the Politics of the National Front, by David Edgar, a left-wing playwright. Also a book called Fascists by Michael Billig, a social psychologist, based on interviews with middle-rank National Front members. Edgar argued that although most fascist surface campaigning was against non-white immigrants, the ideology of the movement's inner core said immigrants themselves were pawns of more powerful forces who promoted multiculturalism to undermine the white race. Who were these forces? They were the Jews. Billig's book showed the higher up the movement you went, the more you encountered world Jewish conspiracy theory, classic Nazi anti-Semitism. Many people assume that you have to go back to the 1930s to find Jews in the front line at street level being targeted by fascists. You don't. After the war, between 1946 and 50, fascist groups re-emerged, promoting anti-Semitism, but they were beaten back by a physical anti-fascist campaign organised largely by Jewish ex-army servicemen and women, called the 43 Group. In the 1960s, thousands of anti-fascists broke up a rally where the platform had a banner, "Free Britain from Jewish Control." In the early 1960s, fringe far-right groups held banners proclaiming Hitler was right. They disappeared from view for nearly 50 years, but in the last few years, these banners have reappeared. Racism against black and brown minorities in Britain has deep roots in Britain's imperial and colonial past. Negative stereotypes of inferiority sustained themselves long after the empire collapsed and are still woven through police, criminal justice system, the education system. Anti-Semitism has other deep roots in British society. Sometimes it overlaps with more familiar anti-immigrant racism, but more often it stereotypes Jews not as inferior, but as an intelligent, alien clique conspiring to undermine the nation. The mass immigration of Jews into Britain took place mainly between 1881 and 1905. In 1905, the government passed the Aliens Act, which dramatically reduced Jewish immigration. The Prime Minister who pushed it through was Lord Balfour, who 12 years later promised Palestine to the Jews. Balfour was responding to grassroots campaigners, such as the British Brothers League, whose activists were drawn from struggling working-class communities near Jewish enclaves. People whose work was precarious, whose housing conditions were poor, were convinced by the British Brothers League's middle-class leaders, such as Major William Evans Gordon, that all their problems were caused by Jewish immigrants. Some politicians and many newspapers described Jews as dirty, diseased, parasitic, culturally inferior, alien, as well as being criminals and anarchists. Both Evans Gordon and Balfour were personal friends of a young Zionist called Chaim Weizmann, who later became the first president of Israel. Evans Gordon and Balfour were Christian Zionists and imperialists in foreign policy and anti-Semites at home. The everyday racism suffered by Jews at this time was largely from white workers who saw them as rivals for scarce resources, similar to the xenophobic prejudice against Caribbeans and Asian immigrants later. A more ideologically articulated anti-Semitism emerged in the 1930s. The British Union of Fascists, formed by Sir Oswald Mosley in 1932, portrayed working class Jews as rivals of the indigenous working class, but he focused more on the alleged machinations of wealthier Jews, portraying them as immensely powerful, accusing them of controlling the economy, the media, the political system. From autumn 1934, Mosley made anti-Semitism the central plank of his fascist ideology. He defined a battle between the cleansing spirit of fascism and the Jews as an unclean, alien influence in our national and imperial life. Mosley preferred Mussolini to Hitler at first, but in 1936, his movement, the British Union of Fascists, added "and National Socialists" to its name, embracing Hitlerite anti-Semitism. Street corner speakers for the movement still cast Jews as criminals, bad landlords, rivals for jobs and homes, but also describe them now as rats and vermin, subhumans, pestilence, a cancer that had to be removed. Anti-Semitism was popular among sections of every class of the population in Britain. The fascists had 500 branches in the country, including 20 branches at private fee-paying schools for the wealthy, and that helped to sustain an anti-Semitic mindset among sections of the upper middle classes after World War II when they were adults. I have a strong perception that anti-Semitism in Britain is rising today, together with other hatreds. That's my subjective perception. But it's also supported by the principal organisation collecting data on anti-Semitism, which is called the Community Security Trust. It's a mainstream Jewish body that works closely with the police. They also work closely with the main institution claiming to represent the Jewish community, the Board of Deputies of British Jews, but is independent from it. In political terms, the CST, the Community Security Trust personnel, are right-wing Labour and mild Conservatives. They are pro-Zionist and defensive about Israel, but they're not Netanyahu supporters. They are an increasingly reliable source of information on the kinds of incidents that occur and who perpetrates them. Now they are much better at differentiating between politically motivated abuse relating to Israel and Zionism and anti-Semitic abuse, and they reject claims of incidents suffered by Jews where they cannot identify a clear anti-Jewish motive. Their end-of-year report for 2017 recorded more than 1,300 incidents nationally that year, but left out several hundred which were claimed but which they couldn't prove an anti-Jewish motive. Their facts indicate a significant and gradually increasing level of attacks on Jewish individuals, sometimes on groups like school children, and on Jewish institutions, synagogues and cemeteries. A typical attack involves verbal abuse, threatening behaviour, and sometimes physical assault. Victims of assault are often ultra-Orthodox Jews, attacked for how they dress. Muslim girls and women wearing the hijab face very similar street harassment. The language used in these attacks frequently references the Holocaust and Hitler. Jewish communal leaders claim that the principal threat to Jews comes from the left. But where the Community Security Trust can identify the perpetrators, they're mainly on the white far right. But there are increasing numbers of incidents perpetrated by other minorities who themselves experience racism. And these perpetrators from other minorities often use the same Hitler and Holocaust tropes. The far right have flooded the internet with poisonous anti-Semitic ideas, alleging conspiracies by Rothschild bankers and Rothschild Zionists. These powerful conspiracy theories are entering mainstream and minority cultures. Sometimes they are unwittingly shared by leftists, thinking they are sharing pro-anti-capitalist or pro-Palestinian material, but they are actually tainting both of those just struggles. Jewish establishment responses to anti-Semitism and the far right, and to racism in general in Britain, have long been inadequate, but they've also undergone historical shifts. Today, the Board of Deputies sees anti-Semitism everywhere. Yet in the 1930s, when working class Jews faced sustained abuse and assaults from organised fascists, the Board of Deputies and the main Jewish newspaper, the Jewish Chronicle, dismissed it as exaggerated and treated the perpetrators simply as Hitler copycats. They refused to believe that anti-Semitism could flourish in a country they saw as fair, decent and tolerant. When that movement terrorised Jewish communities and threatened to march, as opposed to there, threatened to march right through the Jewish working class heartlands, the deputies and the Jewish Chronicle advised Jews to stay indoors, the urgent warning there, keep away, stay indoors and avoid protest actions that might lead to disorder. The community ignored them and inflicted a people's defeat on the fascists, which you mentioned about Cable Street, through mass action, and it was known as the Battle of Cable Street in October 1936. Soon after that, Jewish leaders began blaming Jewish behaviour for provoking anti-Semitism. In the 1970s and early 1980s, when the National Front were mainly targeting blacks and Asians, though anti-Semitism had not disappeared, Jewish leaders acknowledged the main problem was the far right, but they trusted in the very same authorities who frequently mistreated immigrant communities. When there was a mass, broad-based anti-fascist movement, the Anti-Nazi League, created by leftists in 1978, the Jewish establishment tried to dissuade Jews from joining it. They claimed that the Anti-Nazi League leaders were known for their anti-Zionist activism. I believe that the Jewish establishment was less worried about Israel than about the prospect of young Jews associating with militant leftists. The Jewish Socialists Group, a radical fringe group, openly challenged communal leaders, and we helped to recruit Jews to the Anti-Nazi League. A bigger confrontation with the Board of Deputies came in the early 1980s. The Jewish Socialist Group obtained and released information kept under wraps by the Board of Deputies about an increasing number of serious anti-Semitic incidents in London perpetrated by the far right. Jewish leaders tried to hide that from the community on the basis that it might alarm the community and encourage Jews to make common cause with other minorities. They preferred to deal with it privately, in close cooperation with the police and state authorities. Contrast that with Britain in recent years, where British Jewish leaders see anti-Semitism everywhere, including where it is not present at all. This has coincided with their adopting a much more strident and explicit anti-left agenda, especially after Jeremy Corbyn, a pro-Palestinian radical socialist, became leader of the Labour Party. Tomorrow there is another paper specifically on that, and I don't want to intrude on that, but just make a few observations. The left, in its many organisations, have been the strongest and most militant fighters against racism and fascism in Britain, but they have not always recognised the continuing presence and significance of anti-Semitism. Some elements of the left, for whom Palestinian concerns are very important, recognise that anti-Semitism provides the self-justification for Zionism. They mistakenly believe that giving attention to anti-Semitism weakens their support for Palestinians. It doesn't. Jewish communities are increasingly polarized over Israel, Palestine, and Zionism. Every reliable survey of Jewish community opinion in Britain shows a decline in self-identification with Zionism, with the term Zionist, down from more than 70% to 59% in the last decade. Increasing number of Jews speak out for Palestinian rights, and those numbers would be greater still if those speaking up for Palestine also consistently denounced anti-Semitism. Jewish community leaders speak and act as if there is rampant anti-Semitism on the left. They could cynically conflate opposition to Israeli policy, critiquing of Zionism, with anti-Semitism. They promote the lie that that Zionism is an eternal and intrinsic part of Jewish identity, rather than it being merely one of several emerging political ideologies vying for support among Jews at the end of the 19th century. There are two errors frequently made on the left that make it open to criticism from Zionists. Leftists often refer to Israel when they mean the Israeli government, or the Israeli military, or the Israeli settlers. This homogenizes all Israeli Jews, and erases the internal opposition. There are growing numbers of brave but harassed oppositionists within Israel, who are a mixture of anti-Zionists, non-Zionists, and left-wing Zionists. How they define themselves is less important than what they do against the occupation. The left should recognise and broadcast what Israel's internal opposition is doing. The other error is to frequently make analogies between Israeli state practice and Nazism. The accusation often seems intended to wound rather than enlighten. It reveals a lack of historical understanding or empathy with the Jews under Nazism. Aspects of Israeli policy are certainly similar to practices in the early years of Nazism, but there are perhaps closer similarities with other racist, ultra-nationalist regimes, or with ethnic cleansers, for example during the Yugoslav wars. Why are we obsessed with making analogies? We can surely find all the arguments and evidence to promote Palestinian justice just in the practice yesterday, of Israeli governments and institutions that have been about and continue to be about dispossession, exclusion, discrimination, oppression. We don't need to invoke Hitler. Despite these errors, it is the left that consistently exposes and combats those who genuinely threaten the future well-being of all minorities in Britain today. Leaders of Britain's Jewish community highlight any perceived anti-Semitism on the left, even if the evidence is very flimsy. Yet they are silent on the regimes in Central and Eastern Europe today, where anti-Semitism rides in tandem with Islamophobia, anti-Roma prejudice, all kinds of bigotry. But those regimes enjoy close relationships with Benjamin Netanyahu. Finally, I want to say we are entering a dangerous period with the growth of the British far right, where the traditional alliance between the left and the Jewish community has broken down. And I think this urgently needs to be addressed.